Hi everyone, I'm Wendy Muse, creator of the LeftPOC Project, which brings you the history of leftists of color, one swipe at a time. And this is the LeftPOC Project podcast. Before I get started today, as per usual, I would just like to remind everyone to check out the LeftPOC Project on social media simply by searching for @LeftPOC, and that's LeftPOC. Also to check us out, of course, on Patreon, where you can donate $1 or more per month to support the podcast and help us keep things free for everyone and all listeners. Again, that's patreon.com/LeftPOC. You can also find other goodies there, like books and readings and things that we've talked about on the side, or interviews that I've done or others have done on the side related to the project, so definitely check that out. So I just want to get started. Today's going to be a quickie again. Tomorrow I'm going to do a LeftPOC of the week, so be sure to check that out as well. We're going to get started with our full-on history bit in a more formal way. But today I want to introduce a little bit of history too. And it comes by way of Thurgood Marshall, who was a Supreme Court justice. Some of you may be familiar with him, some not. But anyway, if you have a moment, please check him out. I mean, he's got a really, he's deceased now, of course, but he has a really illustrious record, very interesting backstory. I remember when I was little, like my mom talked about him a lot. And I did a book report on his biography in like second grade or something. I don't remember much about him now, as much as I did back then. I knew more then than now. But that was like a bajillion years ago. But anyway, I came across a quote of his that I think is really important. And it's from an interview that he did, or actually a news conference when he was retiring from his position as a Supreme Court justice in 1991. And George H.W. Bush was president at the time. And because of his retirement, George W. Bush used it as an opportunity to bring on Clarence Thomas, whom, as many of you all know, is very conservative, whereas Thurgood Marshall was not and was a very liberal judge. But in Bush appointing Clarence Thomas, one of the things that many said was, it was going to be historic. It was going to be another black man to replace, the first black Supreme Court justice and all of this. And Thurgood Marshall just kept it all the way real when he replied to the press when they were asking him these questions upon his retirement. I mean, this is the kind of frank response that I miss, right, from people who are in office or leaving office. You don't really hear this kind of language as much anymore, and I feel like people are often really guarded. But I was like, woo, the shade levels on this are just astounding, but in a really good way. So he was asked by the press, member of the press in 1991, do you think President Bush has any kind of obligation to name a minority candidate for your job? And he replied, I don't think that should be a ploy, and I don't think it should be used as an excuse one way or the other. And the question continued, an excuse for what, Justice? For doing wrong. I mean, for picking the wrong Negro and saying I'm picking him because he's a Negro. I'm opposed to that. My dad told me way back that you can't use race. For example, there's no difference between a white snake and a black snake. They'll both bite. And I just, I was like, oh my gosh, that is a very bold response. And one that, as I said, like nowadays, a lot of people don't talk like that anymore. And I miss that frankness in many ways. And I wish that we could kind of go back to that, especially if it's on the side of justice, right? And on the side of, making things right on these levels. What he's talking about, of course, is this kind of tokenism that's often used in place of a recognition of merit, in the case especially for conservative goals, right? And when I say conservative goals, I'm not just talking about like capital C, conservatives or Republican Party members. I'm talking about people who are conservative, neoliberal in many cases nowadays, that sort of use the idea of, unfortunately distort, I should say, the idea of racial equality for the sake of accomplishing goals that really are harmful to those very same communities that they're tokenizing. People who are of color are still in this country often marginalized economically, dealing with severe economic inequality, a lack of access to a multitude of resources, environmental racism, being cut off from educational resources or dealing with education that is just incredibly subpar. So many issues, right? And that's not the case for every single minority group, of course. So just to be clear, when I say of color, I'm thinking of all just in comparison to white people. But that's not, of course, considering the differences between those groups. I'm using this as a very broad term. But if we're speaking in particular about Black people in this country, the grand majority of the Black population continues to remain, lower economically speaking, in comparison to other racial groups and in comparison, of course, to the majority of white people. And so, it's interesting when we talk about, also, I guess I should say, the distortion of identity politics. That term has been thrown around and completely destroyed and removed from its original meaning in a way that seems nefarious, just to be completely honest, and in many cases it is. Same thing with critical race theory and some of these other ideas. And that's not to get at the kind of flaws or shortcomings of those ideas. But I think that the mainstream garbling of these ideas is really unfortunate, because they do offer us, some different forms of analysis that are useful, in my opinion, still, even on the left. And quite frankly, they came from the left, right? So I think that they're important for us to consider. And those of them who are throwing them away just because of the right-wing framing are doing so oftentimes with ill intent, and in bad faith. So if we're looking at going back to, what Thurgood Marshall said, it just feels so apt. He's saying this in 91. Some of the people listening to this weren't even born at the time. I was very young at the time. And I remember the trials for Clarence Thomas, his appointment, or sorry, I shouldn't say trials, but the hearings, Senate hearings. And I remember the Anita Hill scandal and all of that stuff, and his sexual harassment allegations and things like that. I remember all of that very vividly, even though I was young, because my mom let me watch the news. And likewise, I remember the OJ trial and all of that stuff, right? But, just kind of thinking back again on Thurgood Marshall's point, I didn't see that press conference when I was little, and I don't think I would have fully understood, obviously, the implications that were being laid out there by him. But I think they're still apt for us to think about today, and especially to consider, as we're being told over and over, that certain presidential candidates or certain senators or certain representatives or certain people in politics are the answer by virtue of their just being of color, quite frequently, still to this day, right? And I think we're kind of met with the idea of, any person of color will do. And that is so insulting and so frustrating to deal with, because especially like as a person of color, as a Black person specifically speaking, if I take issue with someone who's of color in a position of power, it's not because they're of color. It's because I disagree with whatever their policies are, or their approach to certain policies are. And unfortunately, I think some people, including those on the left, take advantage of that sort of opposition to policy and use their own form of sort of distorted racial play, if you will, in the political sense, and use other people of color to then be the sole critics of people of color. And so it becomes like a POC on POC violence sort of thing. When in actuality, what we're criticizing is the failures politically or policy based or whatever of those people. But because of the kind of strange demands now that we have, in the sense where the idea is like, white people can't criticize people of color, even if they have political power. And then only other people of color are allowed to speak on behalf of the community in opposition to these people, or speak on behalf of the community, period, or to speak about these people in any way. And then, of course, if there is a white person who criticizes them, they're seen as, or, sort of portrayed as racist. But then the challenge is that, like, sometimes those people are racist, and they are attacking those representatives or politicians or whatever disproportionately because they are of color. And so it becomes this really strange space to navigate, because on the one hand, if I'm critical of someone, let's say, who's Black, I feel obligated to say something just because I'm critical of them and their politics. But then there's an added obligation, because I'm also another Black person, that it has to be my voice that's at the forefront of these arguments so that it won't be seen as racism. But then at the same time, sometimes people of color are sort of utilized by even the most liberal or left-leaning people to be the spokesperson or the outspoken critic because of their color. So it's like we're being, I don't know, we're caught between a rock and a hard place as people of color on the left in many cases, because we feel obligated to say something, but at the same time we don't want to become the mouthpieces for white people with, like, some sort of, in some cases, racist aggression towards these people. We don't want to add to that chorus in many cases. And so it's a very difficult position to be in. And I think that a lot of us are grappling with that on a regular basis, in fact, because while I don't feel like I need to bite my tongue just because someone is Black, I also am very mindful of the fact that sometimes when I say those things, or let's say if I'm critical of a woman, for example, my criticism against Hillary Clinton for many years, and even when I make comments now about Hillary Clinton, they like get a ton of retweets, a ton of responses and likes and things like that. And I'm always kind of like, are people doing this because they truly value my opinion? Or are they doing this because they see me as another woman or another woman of color, a person of color or whatever, who's making these criticisms that then become a sort of way that whites who are critical can live vicariously through my critique, if that makes sense. So I think sometimes we, as people of color, when we criticize other people of color in politics, become then the avatar for whites who have other grievances that may go well beyond the politics of these people that we're being critical of. And that is frustrating. Like, that's really, 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 really frustrating. And, in some ways I feel somewhat reluctant at times to make criticisms that I feel are needed and valuable, because I just don't feel like seeing some of the ways that the comment sections will turn, right? Because sometimes they get really ugly and people will say racist things and you're like, hey, I'm Black, like, you gotta chill out. And it's sometimes veiled racism, right? That, like, you feel, as a person of color, but you can't quite put your finger on, but you can tell by the tone that's used in the comment that there's, like, a certain kind of underlying aggression that's not just about the policy, but it's also about something else. It's about the gender, it's about the race of that person. And then when you try to talk about that, you're accused of, mobilizing around identity politics. And again, their distorted version of identity politics, not the actual meaning of identity politics. And it's like Black feminist socialist roots, right? So yeah, it's always a dynamic that can be frustrating to navigate and deal with. And I think it's really indicative, not so much of problems on the left or problems on the right, but just like problems of our society being this racist hellhole that we have to deal with, regardless of what party or group we follow in this country as people of color. But I also think, women can speak to a similar dynamic regardless of race, right? But speaking for myself as a Black woman, like, sometimes I feel like, there's not really a space for many women of color, or Black women specifically, who are far left, right? Like, who are communists or socialists or whatever, for real. And, our representatives as Black women in the media are predominantly liberal and like neoliberal, to be more specific. Black Republicans are a total mess, and I would never see them as allies because they believe in sort of self-destructive policies. Then, and they're of course oftentimes our class uh, enemies. Same with many politicians on the Democratic side as well, of course, to be perfectly clear. And then, with white leftists and some other leftists of color who are non-Black, there's still an issue of racism sometimes in those spaces. You go to feminist spaces and you're dealing with racism as well. And then in Black spaces, you're dealing with misogyny. Just thinking of like, if I'm speaking solely for myself, right? There are degrees of misogyny and degrees of sexism, degrees of racism, etc. in all of these spaces. And classism, of course, pervades throughout as well. And I think that there becomes this like, I don't know, you kind of feel, I've always said that you feel like you're on this island, right? And not only do you feel like you're on the island, but sometimes when you meet or come across by chance, these other Black women who are leftists, or at least represent themselves as such, there are sometimes problems, right? Because we're not all the same, and we don't all have the same political leanings, and we don't even all have the same motivation or reason for getting involved in leftist politics or thought. Sometimes our reasons are very different, if not counter to leftist movements. That's perhaps a topic for another day, but some people may know what I'm talking about. But I think that there are some people out there who are using this as a way to climb up, but who don't really mean or not as deeply invested in many leftist principles, but are kind of using their position as themselves a token or like this unique kind of unicorn of sorts in the space, and trying to carve out a space to make themselves the only one, much like how Candace Owens did on the right. I think there's that dynamic as well for some people on the left. And I find it to be, disappointing, disturbing, and unnecessary. And I think it's just indicative of sort of the spiral downwards to a lot of these efforts still being about capitalism, right? Driven by the idea of making money and becoming famous more than they are about ideology and principles, and actual freedom, right? Like gaining some, I don't want to say foothold, but I don't know, some semblance of freedom. And, some people would argue that even looking for that is a fool's errand because we live in a settler colonial state and we are still, the disposable people within it, among many others. But, indigenous people, Black people are the surplus population at this point, right? We kind of always have been in many ways, because even when we were used for our labor, our lives were often cut short at a moment's notice, at a blink of an eye, because we were replaceable, right? We were seen as replaceable. And so I think that kind of sentiment continues into the present, and some people are willing to, engage in what I would consider unprincipled actions for the sake of cultivating an audience that they think will find them valuable. But soon enough, they also realize that is not really a good idea. Because if the audience you cultivate is an audience that will turn on you in the blink of an eye, do you really want that audience? Do you really want that support? And I think people are thinking about the short-term gains, again, financially and through fame, more than they're thinking about long-term gains, about freeing, liberating a group of people, finding our freedom through our voice and finding our freedom through our actions. I think some people are not really about that life and they're doing something else. And so we just have to be careful, as Thurgood Marshall said, right? A snake is a snake, right? A snake can be black, a snake can be white, but they both bite. And you have to be careful about that. And I think we have to be very careful about, who we put in power, who we choose, or people who take the position of representation for certain groups. And that can be on a very small scale, be it podcasters or YouTubers or like local community group leaders, or at the very high level, like people running for president. So we just have to be careful and mindful of that, critical when we need to be, vocal when we need to be. And I think most importantly, always working sort of within our communities to try to support leaders who are really into and about the life of fixing and changing things for us and liberating our groups at the end of the day, like liberating our communities, making life better for people. I think when you find someone like that, you have to support them, and you should support them by any means necessary. And stop falling for the grifters and stop falling for the people who are just in it to sell you out the first chance they get. Because there's a lot of that. And you just have to be mindful of knowing, being able to tell the difference, as I mentioned before, between people doing that for money and people who are really invested in community change and progress of some sort, if not a full eradication of the state that oppresses us and its institutions that do the same. So anyway, with that said, have a wonderful night, everyone. That was Vlogmas, or excuse me, not Vlogmas. My goodness, I'm really tired, as you can tell. It's been a long weekend. That was the Podmas episode, or installment number 4. So, like I said, tomorrow I'm going to do a LeftPOC of the Week episode. So I'll talk about a leftist of color from the past and their history and their connection to, contemporary movements. I think that's it for now. Like I said, make sure that you check out the LeftPOC Project podcast through wherever you get your podcasts. So Spreaker, Soundcloud, iTunes, Spotify, blah, blah, blah. You can also, of course, check out the project and anything that we produce for the project on our Patreon page, and that's patreon.com/LeftPOC. And of course, follow us on social media by searching for @LeftPOC. You can talk to me, Richard, etc. Be sure to do that. And you can, of course, find our interviews and other posts, politics stuff, etc. on all of those sites. Take care of yourselves. Have a good Monday going back after the break for Thanksgiving. If you had a break, hopefully you had a few days off or a day or two to enjoy your time. But if you're going back into the office, back into the workplace, my hat off to you. My day back is on Tuesday, so Monday's going to be a work from home kind of day. I will still be working, but just on the domestic front, which makes me tired. It never really ends. I'm always working on the domestic front, but you know what I mean. Like Monday's going to be kind of my catch-up day. We'll see how that goes. Anyway, everyone take care of yourselves. Be safe, be well, and have a good one. Bye-bye.